I think as procurement professionals, we solve a lot of problems daily when the macroeconomic situation is quite volatile. And I think that makes it tough. I think we've been through a tough couple of years as both supply chain and procurement professionals, where we went through a lot of supply disruptions, inflation. And so there was a lot of focus on procurement. And so that was challenging, but exciting at the same time.
So welcome back, everyone, to this edition of Smarter Sourcing. My name is John Pavia, and today we have with us Heleen Du Toit, who is the Vice President of Procurement, Rigid Packaging at PepsiCo. Did I say that right?
Correct. Absolutely.
So now you've been in the job there all of, what, a week?
2 weeks.
2 weeks. Unbelievable. Great company nearby. I'm in Connecticut, and it's right across the line. But it's quite an honor for you, I'm sure, to be at such a great company. I know you just got there. But before we get to PepsiCo, maybe you can give us a sense of your personal journey of how you got to PepsiCo and how you got into the role, into the career that you're in.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And that's a really good question. I will talk about both experience and skills, because I think you need both as you grow in your career. So when it comes to experience, I actually didn't start my career in procurement at all. I had a colorful career pre-procurement, working in a range of industries and roles. So from banking to sales to commercial management and manufacturing. And I really think the breadth of experience has helped me to become a better procurement professional, as it gives you insight to the other side of the business as well. When I was finally recruited into a procurement role, I managed to do a full rotation in all different functions of procurement. And I did this in an international career path, spanning different markets from Africa to Asia to Europe and the Americas. I did work in both directs and indirects procurement, and did a full rotation from operations to buying to strategy to business partnering. And that definitely rounded my ability to cover procurement end to end in any level of an organization, and also to lead with in-depth knowledge of what my teams go through on a day-to-day basis.
Now, here you are early on in your career. Did you at first, and I can tell you from my experience as a lawyer, when I first started, I had to get experience in different areas of law.
Yes.
In law firm I went to. And there were certain areas that I touched on that I never in law school thought I wanted to be a part of. And I ended up enjoying it. When you first started to do your first rotation in procurement, was your first reaction, procurement? Was that your first, was that your first sentiment?
I had a pretty soft landing into procurement, because I started in what we call a strategies and insights role. So really understanding how the mechanics worked and developing frameworks before I got into more what we call the harder part of procurement, which is the buying and the core negotiations. So it was an easy entry into procurement, and I enjoyed all of it equally. I think as procurement professionals, we solve a lot of problems daily when the macroeconomic situation is quite volatile. And I think that makes it tough. I think we've been through a tough couple of years as both supply chain and procurement professionals, where we went through a lot of supply disruptions, inflation. And so there was a lot of focus on procurement. And so that was challenging, but exciting at the same time.
So now let's continue on in the journey, your own personal journey, how you end up at PepsiCo.
Yeah. So I spoke a bit about experience, but I think skills is another important thing that we do need to focus on. And I think for a procurement person, there's 4 characteristics or skills that really drive growth in this field. And I think those things have stood me in really good ground. The first is high commercial and financial acumen. You need a strong understanding of how your actions drive both growth and margin in the business, and how cost models and macroeconomics all work together. Second is strong negotiation skills, which involves an understanding of people and psychology. So there is a lot of strong guidance on negotiation method that requires a certain level of acumen, but ultimately it's still people talking to people. Third, I would say strong operational and problem-solving ability. Procurement people have to constantly solve problems and execute operationally, like I mentioned, especially when the macro environment becomes very volatile. And then lastly, a strategic mindset that enables the development of a vision or strategy that takes the business from where it is today to where it should be in the future. And you won't believe how strategic procurement can actually be and how transformative it is in terms of structural changes that we need to drive. So strategy is all about solving large and complex internal and external challenges with a transformative vision and a plan, which we do in procurement a lot.
Which is the one that's hardest to teach? And which is the one that, and probably the same one, that you say to yourself right away when you have a new person in your department that you're able to detect either a strength or a weakness?
I think the one that's hardest to teach is most likely the strategic mindset, because that develops over time. You really need a good understanding of your commercial and financials. You need strong intuitive negotiation skills, and you need to have gone through a process of strong operational and solving big problems before you can really understand the strategy. And it also takes a connect to the business. But you don't need only strategic people in procurement. You need a mix of all of them, really. And so it's really realizing which are the best people to match to the best roles in procurement and getting the best out of them to deliver the best result for the business.
See, I would have thought your answer would have been the hardest one to teach is the negotiation skills, because some of that I think comes innately, whereas I think the hardest one maybe to learn maybe how procurement aligns with the greater vision of the company. Because I hear that from everyone I talk to, that, especially in the large companies, but any size company, sourcing procurement, it's so much aligned with the short-term and long-term strategic goals of the company. And that sometimes is hard for, the younger, newer people to procurement and sourcing to sort of get their heads around. But the negotiation skills, those I think are the ones where, again, having touched on sourcing and procurement and been involved with it from a distance a little bit, sometimes I feel I can see this person is going to be a good negotiator and that they've got good street sense. But the other part you can teach, but it's more of a scholastic exercise than it is nature exercise.
And you're very right. But negotiation is very diverse as well. And you really need to develop your own style. You need to realize what you're good at and what you're not good at. Some people have poker face, some are more expressive, some use the very taught negotiation methodology, others are more intuitive. And so, like I said, there is a science behind it, but I've seen people who I'd never think be good negotiators actually be the best negotiators. I read a very good book by Chris Voss called Never Split the Difference. And in that book, he talks about quite a few negotiation tactics. And one of them is tactical empathy. And so, whereas Harvard teaches a lot of negotiation methods, he actually takes a slightly different view, and he speaks about establishing that common ground. And so when you meet somebody, you would think, wow, no poker face, not a very tough guy. I don't think they'll ever be a good negotiator, but they have an immense skill in tactical empathy, which allows the other party to feel safe, open up more information until you get what they call the black swan. It's that piece of information that you need in order to exchange for what you want. And so I would say really it depends. And negotiation is so diverse that a lot of different methods work in different situations.
So did you ever think about becoming a prosecutor or going to a trial attorney? Because they are, I think the best, there's different methods of trial strategy, but I think really great trial attorneys, it all comes down to cross-examination and closing arguments. But cross-examination, by far the harder of the two. And I think the most effective strategy is coming across initially with empathy to a witness who you're eventually going to attack and try to chop into a bunch of little pieces, but at first trying to make them feel safe.
Without a doubt, you will not believe how much authenticity actually works in a negotiation. And so I think that's what you're alluding to is really when you're perceived as truly authentic and having the best intentions, people are far more willing to partner and open up and share information. And so as long as you use that tactically, with intent, it can make you a really good negotiator without anybody realizing that you're negotiating.
So going back to your journey, was there a moment where you said, and maybe it wasn't one moment, but does anything stand out in your memory where you said to yourself, man, this is This is a lot more interesting than I ever thought it was going to be. And this could be a career for me, just staying with sourcing and procurement.
So we've spoken about negotiation, but I do want to talk about another topic that I'm very passionate about. And it's the topic of supply and cost resilience. And that's really linked to disruption and inflation. And I'll talk a little bit about a framework that I developed early on in my career that made me think, wow, this is really interesting. I would like to stay in procurement. So in 2015, I was tasked with leading the development of a resilience framework that would help us better understand crisis and how to respond to the many supply outages that we were facing at the time. So what was significant is that we were mostly reactive in dealing with the challenges and trying to find solutions only after a crisis happened. This was not only costly for us, but it also took time to find those solutions, which led to us being out of stock in terms of our finished goods or product on shelf at the retailers. And as you know, a supply crisis is statistically correlated to inflation as well. So supply and demand is a key principle, and cost is something that we manage in procurement. We changed the approach in our framework. And we asked, how could we become more preventative and proactive rather than reactive? So what we did is we designed a risk measurement tool that would measure our inbound supply weakness against 15 risk factors. These risk factors were weighted in terms of scale of impact, and then we applied a simple numerical rating to them to identify them as low, medium, or high risk based on a set of criteria for each risk factor. So what they do for us is it gave us a risk profile or a hot map that highlighted where specifically we had weakness in our supply chain. And the fact that we now had visibility to where exactly the risk was and what this risk profile of our inbound supply chain looked like, it helped us to create more targeted and tailored and totally proactive actions to the risk. And we could implement those actions before a crisis actually happened. And so when we did this, that really sparked an interest for me. It became one of our 4 global supply chain pillars, and it actually still in use today. And we're evolving this framework to now looking at crisis in particular and using regression analysis and then converting that to predictive modeling to understand the scale and nature of disruptions a little bit better.
So you were not artificial intelligence, you were human intelligence before there was any ChatGPT, because you were trying to foretell the future in terms of what would we really be in a panic over if something like a pandemic hit, correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're evolving this model now. So I'm actually in partnership with Dr. Mark Rogers from Rutgers Business School, and we're rethinking the problem. So to put this in layman terms, what we're trying to do is identify historical factors that resulted in supply disruptions, understanding the causal relationship between them, and then we are looking at these factors as they appear today and attempting to model what the outcomes would look like on a likelihood scale. So this foresight will help us far better anticipate and plan for disruptions, as we can then create these tailored and targeted response plans. And you mentioned AI. What we're trying to do is we're trying to do this fully with artificial intelligence as an enabler. I think AI has brought a host of opportunities that will revolutionize procurement, but the test will be how we remain in the driver's seat to make it work specifically to the result that we're trying to drive.
So going back to the model that you created, are you allowed to, or can you give us a couple of instances, or maybe one in particular, where you and your team identified a risk or vulnerability, and whether it was the pandemic or some other world event that ended up happening that, sure enough, and you guys were able to better react to it because you had done a lot of game planning with this model?
Absolutely. So a great example of this very close to us here in the US was in 2022 when we had the avian influenza crisis that impacted the chicken and egg industry. And you might remember paying quite a bit for your eggs on shelf during the time. That AI resulted in the culling of approximately 50 million birds out of an approximate 400 to 450 million egg-laying birds in the US. I was still working at another multinational at the time, and this was a high risk for one of our products, which was largely dependent on egg supply. So let me take a step back. 1 year prior, an amateur output of our tool made us aware that avian influenza would likely reoccur in the near future and on a large scale. Our value chain risk assessment also showed that we had weakness or risk factors in our value chain that we needed to tackle. 1, we lacked diversification of supply. 2, we were mostly outsourced. 3, we had poor inventory capacity. And 4, we lacked responsiveness. So the nature of the weakness in the supply chain combined with the scale of the event that we could foresee would prove to be disastrous for us. However, having this information and insight upfront meant we could get to work on the solutions early on. So what we did was we firstly backward integrated our value chain by starting to manufacture a part of the blend ourselves. This allowed us to partner with a supplier that had very deep vertical resilience. What this means is they could alternate between various farms and production facilities, often not geographically co-located, without us having to switch between different suppliers and paying additional costs for it. We also invested in capacity to ensure our inventory allowed us sufficient response time to get our value chain switched on. And let me tell you, we sailed through avian influenza in 2022. And I'm not sure if we would have been as successful if it wasn't for the foresight we have in terms of the outputs of this tool.
That's an awesome story. So to the extent that you're able to give us an answer to this question, what's around the corner? What do you have your eye on right now? You haven't said to yourself, there's a problem there, and maybe not. I don't want to know what's a weakness in PepsiCo's supply chain, but just worldwide. So we had the egg crisis. Is there something else out there right now that you just got your eye on? Because you said, well, if another avian flu hit or another pandemic, we would really be hard up for, besides toilet paper. We were all looking for toilet paper.
So you're asking me what's next. What's next is how do we commercialize this model so that the industry can actually use it? And then a lot of people ask the question, so what is the next big event? And quite honestly, we're seeing it being very diverse in terms of the industry that you're in, whether it's climate risks such as hurricane season coming up. We're already seeing that hurricane season will be worse than it was in the years before, whether it's restrictive government policy that is impacting supply and demand, or escalating geopolitical tensions that's really showing us the cusp of the next potential war that's going to happen. So it really depends on your industry that you're in and understanding what that risk is. But they're all there, they're all underlying, and they're all waiting for us to respond to. And I don't think a lot of them are that far away in the future.
Do your models change drastically based on who the next president is or what happens in the election? No, see, I mean, you hear it all the time, actually, on CNBC and Bloomberg.
I can tell you now that in our model, geopolitical risk was never weighted as high as it is now. And it's actually become a key factor in determining whether there's risk or not. So yes, this year there is a lot of elections happening globally, and each one of them is showing up some form of a red flag for us to look out for in terms of how policy could change, how that could impact nearshoring, imports, duties, tariffs. I mean, we've been through this recently with the Russia-Ukraine war and what that has meant for us in terms of supply and demand. So yes, the answer is geopolitical risk, restrictive government policy, or changing government policy does show up as a red flag that could result in many other areas of supply that could be at risk.
So you started touching on artificial intelligence and the impact it's going to have. But besides that, what's next? What is around the next corner in terms of the next iteration of sourcing and procurement? I mean, we all know that everything now is so much more data-driven than we were 10, 15, 20 years ago. But in the world of sourcing and procurement, what is next? And is it more predictive modeling and commercializing what you did previously? Or you tell me.
So I'll talk about how the evolution of sourcing and procurement has gone, and then I'll talk a little bit about what's next. So in procurement in organizations like ours has gone from being a buying function, delivering both goods and services at optimal cost, to now becoming a key driver of commercial and brand value, as well as transforming into a strategic advisory role to the business. So instead of just buying and delivering productivity, we're now tasked to work with partners to bring elements of competitive advantage and differentiation through innovation. We drive the sustainability agenda in plastic, in agriculture, and in climate. We have to ensure, as I've discussed, a resilient inbound supply chain to continue to facilitate business growth. We have to deliver commercial and market signals to the business for better front-end decision making. And we do need to reshape our thinking from cost to value through the use of sharp market intelligence. It really is about delivering strategic commercial value and insight to the business in order for the business to have competitive edge. So I would like to think that procurement now has a seat at the table in key business decision-making forums. But if you're asking me where next in procurement, I would absolutely call out 5 things in particular. And the first is unleashing the power of generative AI, revolutionizing procurement technology, highly proactive risk management in supply and cost with these creative frameworks that I've spoken about, integrated supplier relationships, and then evolving procurement into a strong business advisory role, as I've discussed.
So I want to go into all those, but I want to ask you this sort of global holistic question. That is, has the seat at the table changed a lot because of the pandemic and how reliant every company, big or small, was during that period?
Absolutely. Because when you have a very stable business, the focus is not on, hey, I need to change things on the front end because of the back end volatility. But suddenly what happened during the pandemic is we had massive deflation. A lot of companies were hedged high, couldn't capitalize on the downturn of the market. Then we had a huge amount of upturn and a massive amount of inflation. And the front end of the business needed to respond to that with product price changes in the market. And that is where the big noise around inflation came from. And so there was a lot of back-end view to procurement to say, what now? What's next? How do we need to respond? Are we responding in the right way? Similarly, the growth of businesses were impacted with the supply of goods being constrained. So apart from just the inflation, we were battling to get goods to our sites. And then ultimately that led to a lot of out-of-stock situations. And I think what that has meant is the business is far more sensitive to understanding the forward outlook that procurement can bring in terms of, hey, what are these back end macro elements? What is the forward view of that? How is it ultimately going to influence the decisions we need to make in the business? So I think you're right. I think the pandemic has really changed how procurement is viewed by the business and utilized by the business as a more strategic advisory role.
I read a book about 6 months ago called The Economist's Hour. And it was the story really of the emergence of economists in the world and their role in the world. And it was fascinating to me that you go back to the early 20th century and economists were sort of dismissed as almost witch doctors trying to tell the future. And book anyway goes through the evolution of the role of economists and how today, they're vital to so many different organizations, including obviously government. In your work, especially at a big multinational, do you work closely with your in-house economists or maybe outside economists also?
If we are not the economists.
I was just going to say, yeah.
So I do think there is a partnership that exists in the business, a strong partnership between finance and treasury and procurement, and that becomes like the economist team. And here's the thing about economists, John. I don't think we'll ever get it 100% right. I think the best economists in the world have been wrong because there are just certain things that you're not able to predict. This is also why we're trying to create models that give us a likelihood scale of events. And that's why we give the business a view on a bull scenario, a base scenario, and a bear scenario so that they could plan for either outcome. And so I think we need to become more agile in terms of what the outcomes could be. But yes, the procurement function, I think, works very closely with finance and to take on that role for big corporations at the moment.
So let's now go to one of the things it was one of the 5 things you mentioned. And I think as I heard it, it almost captures all of them. And that is really becoming a key advisor to the business, and which goes to really knowing your stuff. And you're going to sit down with a CEO, CFO, and give advice about the long-term strategy or even strategy.
Absolutely.
It's really knowing your facts really well before you walk into that meeting. How do you impart that to the younger people coming on we talked about it before, the hardest thing to teach How do you convey that and get your direct reports to really grasp it, not just at a book
Yeah.
level, but really at more than just in a forensic way, but that it really lives in them and it becomes part of their DNA?
That is such a good question. And the first thing you need to do is you need to make them understand how the work that they're doing has an impact on the broader picture of business growth, business results. So that the minute they understand that every decision that I make, every negotiation that I have, every deal that I close has a percentage impact and I can see it in the result of the business, they immediately make the connection. So we find that a lot of young people come in with, and I've mentioned this, financial acumen that's not quite where it needs to be, a lack of understanding of the P&L and how that works. And so that's one of the first things we do is make them understand what the P&L means, where you sit in the P&L, and how your small actions actually drive big results in the P&L of a business. We're a very large part of the gross margin of a business, and we support the growth of a business. So it's easy for them to then make that connection and see it. And when the CEO talks, they're like, okay, I did this. I contributed to that. I had a role to play. And it's super important, especially because procurement is so far at the back end of the business that you have to create that connect and have to make them understand the worthwhile work that they are doing.
So I think it's okay that I reveal this. If it's not, we'll take it out. But you and I had a chance to talk before I went out to Las Vegas to interview Rick Harrison from Pawn Stars. And what I don't think I shared this with you, but I ended up after our conversation sending an email to a bunch of, very accomplished sourcing and procurement people at very large companies like yours. A, did they watch Pawn Stars? And B, if so, did they have any questions for Rick? Everybody from, people at DuPont and you name big companies, they all watch him. And it was so funny to me because they all sort of said the same thing. Like he's the ultimate buyer, like he's, within his negotiation tactics.
The negotiator.
Right.
Correct.
Right. And I asked you any questions for him. And your first question was training. How do you train your people? And it was so funny when you gave me that question. I was like, that's not the first thing I wanted to know, like, what's the wildest thing that ever walked in the door and you had no idea how to bid on it, what the value was. But it ended up, and I'm not saying this to patronize it ended up being one of the best questions because it went to the heart of what you don't see on the show.
Correct.
And it also went to the heart, I think, of good sourcing procurement, which is nobody in real life, forget about the show, in reality, and by the way, the store was unbelievable in terms of the activity that goes on there. But no one there flies solo in terms of negotiating a price for something that's inbound and they're buying without a lot of training. There's a lot of, and it's formalized training, and he has like certification levels. And it was interesting to hear. He'll run these classes, a Monday class on diamonds, another class on watches, and you have to go through a certain amount of these before you're able to like I said, fly solo. But it just goes back to, I think, what real sourcing and procurement is all about, and that is you really need to know your stuff and really put the time in to learn not just what the right price of this item is, but how does it fit into the larger scheme of the company. So with you, I know that education and continuous learning is a big part of what you do. Tell us a little bit about, I know you just got to Pepsi, but your views on continuous education and teaching, mentoring, and what you're planning on doing now that you're at Pepsi.
It's interesting because if you move between CPG companies, there's a thread of things that remain kind of the same. And a lot of us share a lot of the same suppliers. But then there is the nuances of the company that's very different. And I think the biggest learning is, how do I take the skill that I have and really match it to the business strategy? So I think the first thing you need to immerse yourself in is, what does my business strategy look like? And the second thing you need to do is really understand your external landscape. What is the macroeconomic situation? What's your market intelligence looking like, your supply intelligence? And in procurement, we're lucky enough that this is constantly evolving. And so we're in a constant learning process. I don't think anything has stayed static in my tenure in procurement that I've been in. So it's about being open-minded to the changes, the changes in techniques, the changes in evolution of technology, the changing business strategy, and how to bring all of that together to really get and drive the right output. Now, I want to talk a little bit about leadership and the team, because I think that is so important. You are only as good as the team that you lead. So I have spent a lot of time in my career investing in building diverse and highly talented teams, and in working on matching the right person with the right role that's available. It's two things. It's one, realizing that you're not always the smartest person in the room, but surrounding yourself with the most talented people, equipping them with the right skills that they need to fly solo, and then getting the best out of them. It's a little bit like going to war. You need to decide who is your sniper, who is intelligence, who's managing the logistics, who's going on the front end battlefield, who's the backup, and then making sure that you're using the right skill with the right position, and then training on the broader macroeconomics, business strategy, and bringing that together to say, how do we then, as a team, deliver what's best for the business?
You definitely should have been a trial lawyer or a general, a field general. You touched on very briefly, you're with a big multinational. ESG's become a big part of a big focus, and especially for a company like yours, I think you have a bigger spotlight on a company like PepsiCo than, let's say, a smaller company. But you're in the job of making the best decision possible when it comes to what suppliers to use. Yet you've got to be focused on supplier diversity as well. How do you balance those two things?
Companies have to be responsible. It's a big objective of the company, but we get the question a lot. So how do you balance what you do in cost management and still achieving sustainability? And I think I've mentioned before that our roles have gone from delivering cost to delivering value. And I honestly do not think cost or sustainability, the one should come at the sacrifice of the other. So it really is important to develop sustainability efficiently, supported by R&D, technology, and scale, to ensure that the focus is on value creation. So that's about getting to a cost point that will yield the right return on what is being offered. If you're expensing large costs and not covering that with a return somehow, you should not be buying it, especially not at a higher cost. That just makes no business sense. So it's important to keep on developing and refining both the product and the cost until you have a return that matches that cost point. Let me give a good example of what I mean with this. Where the business can recoup the value of the innovation in sustainability through competitive price points and or growth, because that is a consumer preference, that is what we call return on value. And so our integration with the business is really critical in our area. Another great example is this, and I'll use an historical example just because I'm originally from South Africa. But when post-consumer resin first came to the market, it was not a commoditized item to buy, and so was higher than what we call a virgin plastic, for example. But in South Africa, historically, it was one of the markets where PCR was actually cheaper than virgin resin. And that was because of a very well-established network of collection and recycling. And so that means if we focus on building the industry and value chains around sustainability with the right technology, capacity, and scale, we can create more efficient sourcing costs in this regard. And so therefore, it's critical to partner as an industry to build the right value chains with the right technology.
So prior to us recording this, we had an exchange of a couple of things, and it was about last pieces of advice. And your three things were: be fearless, think different, have fun. To have fun, I don't think it needs much explanation, but I think it is important to have fun in what you do. And I would put that up there as a top three thing. Be fearless and think different. So tell us what you've got. This someone's just come into your group, they're on your team, it's their first day with you as they're your direct report, and you're giving them your pieces of advice, and you come to these three things. The be fun is going to, I think, make a lot of sense to everybody, but the be fearless and be different. What do you say to that person sitting in front of you on those 2 points?
I love this question because it's something that I absolutely live by. We don't fail enough, and we don't accept failure enough, and we should, because failure when striving for innovation is the only way that you're going to get there. And so what I really encourage teams to do is to take risks, to bring a big idea and not to be afraid, because along the way you're going to fail. But what's ultimately going to happen is eventually that's going to create the necessary transformation or innovation that we need to be in a different space than what we were before. And so that's one thing I absolutely encourage with my teams. And so, yes, I love that. You need to be fearless. You need to think of solutions that people haven't thought about before. And don't be afraid to fail while doing it, because eventually that will change something or will create a success for us that we need.
So I love this point because I experienced this, and luckily I had a boss who was great and
Correct.
wanted me to was trying to tell me, I want you to make decisions. And you had before made a comment about problem solving. You got to be a problem solver. And I think what a lot of younger people have struggled with, and just people in general, is, boy, the boss wants me to be a problem solver and take the initiative.
Exactly.
But if I screw something up, is it going to stop my job? So I guess, and I told you before, I have 4 kids and 3 of them now out in the working world. And a question I told them is, ask your boss, what does success look like? What do I need to be successful here in this group? But also, if you tell me I'm empowered to go and make decisions, be fearless, be different, what are the parameters? I mean, do I attempt to get a hold of you before I go ahead and make a decision by myself? But I said, ask your whoever's supervising you, what do you mean by that? So what do you mean? What do you mean? I'm sitting there. I say, so what do you mean by that? Because sure, I want to go out and feel like I'm not one of those people who have to bring everything back to you. But on the other hand, when am I going to get my head bitten off by not coming to you?
Yeah, and I think it's a calculated risk that needs to be taken, right? So, and I think it depends on the project that you're working on. I think if there is a failure that's not going to stop the business from growing in any way, that is a tolerable risk that needs to be taken in order to do something that's great. I'll tell you a really good story, and I think one of my previous bosses will really laugh when I tell you the story. But I was a new procurement person at the time, working in South Africa. And one of the big challenges we had was data inaccuracy. So we wanted to create data analytics for our procurement teams to draw in order to be able to use that to make better buying decisions, but the master data was incorrect. And so we found this loophole that we could download all of the data out of our system, change it, re-upload it correctly with one push of a button. Well, all of this happened, but what we didn't realize is that the date codes had a limitation to it. And so when we uploaded it to the system again, all of the date codes defaulted, and we stopped all of the factories in the whole of South Africa for the company that I was working for at the time. And I remember sending a message to my boss to say, just a heads up, but we've just shut down every factory. We fixed it really quickly. What ended up happening is when we got it right, there was a transformative change that happened in terms of our master data being more clean. And it's a small example. But if you don't take those risks and you don't push forward and we don't change the culture to make it acceptable to fail when you're doing the right things and getting the necessary report when things go wrong to get it right, I think then we'll never get to where we need to be. So I hope that example helped to illustrate calculated risk.
It did. This has been great. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I cannot wait to check back in with you 6 months, a year from now. I can't wait to hear how your predictive model has turned out, whether you were able to look into the future. But thanks so much for joining us.
Love to do that with you in the future. Thanks, John.
We'll make it happen. So everybody listening and watching, my name is John Pavia, and this has been Smarter Sourcing. We'll see you in our next episode.